Days 600 to 602, Alexis threw herself at me at a full run. Behind her, Lucky was happily barking and snaking his way past people to get to me. I immediately threw my arms around her, but then gently pushed her off me. She looked confused, her eyes wet with happy tears and searching mine. Alexis, this is Christina, my ex-fiancée from before everything. Awkwardly, Christina stepped forward, introducing herself. I saw recognition dawn on Alexis's face, and it felt like being stabbed in the heart by an Azteco's blade. Oh, I see. She nodded solemnly, drying her eyes. Just then, Lucky crashed into me. There would be no deterring his affections. Lilith and Annie were next. The same dawning realization eventually hitting each one of them as well as I introduced Christina. I felt like a traitor, but, well, it'd been nearly a year. I pushed the guilt away. I never expected to see them all again, especially not Alexis. We were tired from so much time on the road, my knees practically buckling every time one of the girls threw herself into my arms. I was happy to see them all again, but I was exhausted from the road. Sensing this, they led us past Farmbridge's gates. Days 603 to 605. You're kind of an a-hole. Lilith wasn't mincing words. We both sat on top of one of the concrete barriers that made up the perimeter of Farmbridge. The work they'd started a year ago had finally been completed, and the place was a literal fortress. Even with heavy vehicles, any attacker would have a hard time penetrating its defenses. I could tell by her tone that she was only half joking. Surprisingly, she'd taken it harder than the rest that I'd left Big Bear without telling them. Other than, well, Alexis, of course. I know, I'm sorry. But if I told you guys I had to leave, then you would do something stupid like try to come with me. Lilith bristled at this. Is having us around that bad? I shook my head. No, you know that's not at all why I didn't say anything. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping. Yeah, I know. Your heart's always in the right place, but sometimes the things you do, you've got to stop this greater good nonsense. We could have come with you. We could have found somewhere else to stay, like here. I slowly nodded. She was right on more points than either her or I realized at the moment. I thought it would have been better to leave the girls behind at Big Bear when I got banished for lying about who I was. Maybe Lilith was right. Ruslana had always told us we had a place here at Farmbridge, and it was shaping up to be a hell of a place. Do you forgive me? Lilith thought about it for a moment. For leaving? Yeah. For Alexis? No. Days 606 to 610. I had briefed Ruslana on the Iron Lady's proposal and the Azteco threat. I could tell from the way she looked at me that she was having a hard time believing me when I told her about those drug-fueled maniacs. I didn't blame her. It sounded like something out of a horror story. She wanted to address the community, but first she wanted me to brief the heads of the local settlements. Things have changed since you were here last. We've grown, made partnerships and alliances. She grinned, clearly proud of her work. She should be. A year and a half ago, this place was nothing more than a series of farms run by a thug that was currently still rotting in its prison. Now it was a lively trade hub for the Southern California area, with caravans coming through regularly. It sat on the crossroads of trade between survivor settlements in the ruins of San Diego and the Los Angeles outskirts and beyond. Like an ancient trade city, this was making Farmbridge very wealthy. The currency of the day was goods, services, and even more importantly, skills and expertise. Ruslana had bargained and bartered for or simply attracted a host of old-world professionals, technicians, and craftsmen. Workshops safely inside the settlement's concrete walls worked to adapt old technology into the needs of the new world. It was an impressive place. Ruslana had indeed done a good job. The meeting with the other settlement leaders would take place in a week. Until then, I occupied my time with teaching Ruslana's military commanders about the Azteco threat. It was a horde, plain and simple, with human wave attacks meant to soak up enemy resources before the real infantry attacked. There really wasn't much to teach, so I spent most of my time offering a hand here or there, and avoiding Alexis. Days 611 to 613. Watson had spent much of his time with Alana and Clara. The two had settled here in Farmbridge, and were overjoyed to see Watson again. I saw him smile again for the first time since we left to head east. It was nice, but I couldn't get out the image in my mind of him executing that farmer's son. I know our own lives and the lives of everyone we loved back here had been on the line. He'd only done what needed to be done, but the memory haunted me. I'd done what needed to be done plenty of times myself. I think the gulf that had grown between Watson and I wasn't so much because of me blaming him for what he did to that boy, but because it reminded me of everything I'd done in the name of survival or keeping my family safe. It was nice seeing him smile again, though. His usual soft spot for Alana had returned. I never asked him about his old life. There was an unspoken agreement between us not to pry into the painful part of each other's lives, but seeing him with Alana again convinced me that he'd been a father once. Was his daughter still out there somewhere? Or had she been lost long before the world ended? Days 614 to 617. A large map lay spread out in what had become Ruslana's operations center. The whole scene eerily reminded me of the Iron Lady's own compound, only Ruslana didn't tolerate slaving, cannibalism, or any of the violence the Iron Lady's realm had been built on. This was a place of hope for a better future from the ashes of the old world. But I couldn't help but think that the Iron Lady was far better prepared for the Azteco threat than Ruslana's people were. That was the perk of being a tyrant. Watson, Alexis, Annie, and I all ringed the table along with Ruslana and her senior-most people. The map had locations marked in green to the south and north of Farmbridge, with a green dot where Big Bear was located. Slab City on the east bank of the Salton Sea was marked bright red, along with a few smaller and larger dots on the map of the American Southwest. I recognized a few of the large red dots as the Iron Lady's westernmost outposts. They were only a few days' march from here, less if she dedicated vehicles to the fight. There were several blue dots on the map as well. These symbolized important places for resources that were waiting to be explored or exploited. Ruslana stabbed her finger at one such dot located in the northern suburbs of Los Angeles. It was the location of a National Guard armory full of badly needed equipment. A small community has sprung up around the old armory, a bunch of veterans and their families, as well as some of the others they've taken in. We've reached out to them in the past, but they've always rebuffed our invitation to work together. We need the equipment that's in there, one way or the other, especially if all the intel you've given us on the Iron Lady is true. It is, and don't forget about the Aztecos. Ruslana nodded silently. I could see that she still didn't know what to make of my warnings. I almost felt like she was feeling me out, investigating where my loyalties actually lie. Or maybe I was just feeling guilty because in my quiet moments alone it had become harder and harder to deny there was a lot of truth to the Iron Lady's ways. The Aztecos were a critical threat that vastly outnumbered us or the Iron Lady's forces. They would break over us like a tsunami and sweep both forces aside. She sent me back here to talk to Ruslana and the other leaders and convince them that joining her was the only way to survive. Well, technically, she left the choice up to me. We had 4 strikers at the Battle of the Big Sandy River. It wasn't enough. I'd already given the details of the battle to Ruslana and the other settlement leaders. They all said they needed time to mull things over. Then it only makes it even more imperative we get to these weapons. There was a grim look on Ruslana's face that I didn't like. It reminded me too much of the Iron Lady. Are you suggesting we take them by force? Alexis looked horrified at the proposition. Ruslana said nothing, but the look on her face said it all. I tried to calm the situation. Wait, let me go and talk to them. I can tell them about the threat, what's at stake. Ruslana sighed. I'm sending a detachment over tomorrow. You're welcome to join them, but so far they think they're better off working by themselves. I'm going too. Alexis surprised everyone. Yep, me too. Annie nodded, turning to me. We go together, all of us. No more splitting up. Watson nodded his agreement. Days 618 to 623. We traveled north out of Farmbridge, 2 squads of fully equipped soldiers with us. A day later, we met up with another detachment from a settlement down in San Diego, bringing our total manpower up to 24, including our little group. The local leaders had taken my warning very seriously. A 3rd squad of volunteers would be joining us once we hit LA. They were intent on getting their hands on the equipment in that armory one way or another. I had a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach the entire time. Was this really the only way? Alexis tried her best to avoid me, which put the rest of the group in a weird spot, where they felt like they had to choose between her or I. Christina had come along. I don't think she really wanted to, but I'd confessed about my relationship with Alexis, and now, well, I guess she felt like she had to come. Days 624 to 626. Annie and I stood watch in the south end of our camp. The clouds overhead had slowly started to clear up in the last few weeks, the debris from dozens, maybe hundreds of vaporized cities, finally settling out of the atmosphere. You could finally see the stars again, and the sight was mesmerizing. I'd forgotten how much I missed seeing stars. Remember that night we went looking for the raiders and you interrogated that prisoner? Annie didn't have to remind me. I remembered perfectly well what it had taken to extract information out of him. I was glad Annie hadn't been around to see it. I nodded. Remember the promise you made me? I nodded again. Did you keep it? I sighed. I think so. I tried. I really did. I hadn't told her much details about my time with the Iron Lady. I didn't tell her how I'd earned Christina's freedom or how I'd inadvertently forced her to kill her own owner in order to save my life. I thought about Alexis. The pain was clear in her eyes. Yet she still came along to be close to me, even if we weren't really speaking. Thought about Lilith and how she'd darkened after I let her be captured by cannibals. Thought about Christina and how I'd made her a murderer. Maybe I should have stayed away. Maybe I belong over there, in the East. Annie looked at me for a long time before speaking. You kept the people you love safe, but that's cost them. And you need to be aware of that. I sighed. She was right, as usual. Days 627 to 631. The roads were surprisingly safe since the settlements had started banding together. We even came across a patrol securing this stretch of the 5 freeway. Each settlement had agreed to provide a number of men and women a month responsible for security over a stretch of roads in the area. The real clever bit, though, was that Ruslana had negotiated it so that each settlement sent patrols to roads near the other settlements, thus forcing the settlements to start trusting each other, making cooperation easier. We made camp outside of the ruins of LA to wait for the final team joining us. We'd soon be a small army, or at least an entire reinforced platoon with almost the firepower to match. The break let us talk plans for what came next. Ruslana and the representatives from the other settlements made it clear being denied access to the depot was a non-starter. If it came down to it, they were willing to shoot their way in. Part of me was as appalled as Alexis was over the idea, but the other part of me, the part Annie had just warned me to watch out for, knew that Ruslana and the others were right. This was about more than just the survival of one small group of survivors. Farbridge was building a network of communities, maybe even the start of a real nation, and one ruled by reason, justice, and humanity, not fear and tyranny like the Iron Lady's territory. But how could we live up to those values if we murdered everyone in our way to get there? Practicality versus idealism. There had to be another way. Days 632 to 636. The squad linking up with us was a day late. Apparently they'd run into trouble with some raiders. It was a reminder that these lands weren't yet civilized, and there were threats out there other than the Iron Lady and the Aztecos that only made our mission even more urgent. Christina could tell I was agitated as we lay next to each other in our tent at night. You've been distant since we got to Farbridge. I was glad she couldn't see my face in the dark. I don't know what I'm doing back here. What do you mean? I turned on my back to stare up at the dark ceiling of the tent above me. Somewhere outside, I could hear the guys on watch having a conversation and laughing occasionally. The Iron Lady's a monster, but she's brought peace and stability to the east. Farbridge, well, it has a shot, but it's also chaotic. The settlements arguing with each other, disagreeing on this and that. They couldn't stand up to the Iron Lady's forces on their own, and I've got no clue if they'd be willing to try to work together. But it doesn't matter, because neither side could stop the Aztecos alone. I turned over to face her, though it was difficult to see much in the dark. So, what do I do? Who's right here? Christina was silent for a bit before speaking. You've never lived as a slave. It's an awful thing. Having no control over your own life, being property, no system like that deserves to survive. But you're right, neither side can stand on its own. Maybe there's a way to make sure one falls and the other survives. I was surprised. I guess Christina and I never really talked much about her time with the Army of the Dawn. I knew her experiences had been troubling, but she'd never spoken about how she felt. There was a real venom in her words when she spoke about one system falling and the other surviving. She was telling me to set up the Iron Lady, betray her at her most vulnerable. It was a terrifyingly elegant solution. Days 637 to 640. The situation was tense as we approached the National Guard encampment. I could tell immediately these guys knew what they were doing. They'd set up their settlement inside the perimeter of a small National Guard base, itself at the end of a suburban neighborhood. They'd torched the homes within 100 meters of the perimeter fence, giving themselves clear lines of fire at anyone straying too close. The main gate had been reinforced with the same sand and dirt-filled containers we used in Afghanistan to create the walls for our FOBs, and watchtowers ringed the entire perimeter. We'd sent a messenger in advance, so the settlement's leadership came out to greet us with a small security detachment. The guys were fully kitted up. Their M4s looked well-maintained with older ACOG sights. Over their uniforms, they wore body armor complete with plate inserts. If we'd had to take this place by force, it was going to be a hell of a painful fight. Ruslana decided to invite the leadership to our camp. I could tell this was a power play. She was letting them see how many men we'd brought with us and the state of our equipment. Wasn't nearly as good as theirs, but we were well equipped ourselves, enough to show that we were a credible threat. She made a simple point. Didn't waste time with pleasantries or negotiation. If the SoCal settlements were going to survive what was coming, we needed to work together, and that meant sharing the contents of the National Guard armory. The senior representative from the armory shook his head wordlessly. He was a tall man, around 50, who looked like he could do a PT with guys half his age no problem. I suspected he'd been Special Forces at some point, and his name tape read Johnson. You're out of your mind if you think we're just going to hand over heavy equipment to people who may turn around and use it on us. Ruslana huffed aggressively. Clearly, diplomacy was not her thing. Why would we attack you with your own guns? If that's what we were like, we would have done it already. Johnson looked over the camp. Looks like you're ready to do just that. Things were going south quick. And then, to my surprise, Alexis stepped in. Yes, there are some of us who think the situation is dire enough that if it comes to it, we should just take what you have by force. But that's not who we really are. We're, scared. The camp seemed to fall silent. Ruslana shot an eyebrow up in surprise. We're scared of being betrayed by people we try to trust. We're scared of what's out there in the East. We're scared because what we lost in the old world and what it's going to take to get some of it back. but we can't keep being scared for letting fear drive our decisions. Yes, we want your weapons, but only because of what's out there, threatening to destroy the little we've built up. But the truth is, even with your weapons, we probably still couldn't defend ourselves, because what we really need is you. We need a community." You could practically hear a pin drop, and Johnson's stone-cold mask seemed to slip for a moment. "I know you're just trying to protect your families. We are too. But what's out there and coming this way doesn't care about any of that. It'll come for us first, and then it'll come for you." Johnson finally spoke. "I've heard your people talk about this threat out there in the desert, but the only threat I've seen is you and your people. Right here, right now, threatening to kill my people and steal their stuff. If there really is something out there in the desert, we'll tell them the same thing I tell you. Try and breach that perimeter, and it's the last thing you and your people will ever do." Alexis looked at me, her eyes beckoning me to speak up. I took her cue. "That's not how it's going to happen. We've got what, a platoon's worth of men? Surely we can muster up more from amongst the various settlements, maybe put together a company. But I was in the east though. What's waiting out there is an army, fully equipped with combat vehicles too. And past that army, something far worse. A horde of drugged up black magic practicing psychotics that call themselves the Aztecos." I had his attention. 2 of us did recon out there, and I joined with the Army of the Dawn. You've got what, a platoon's worth of men in there? We had a reinforced company with us when the Aztecos came, and we lost. Truth is, yeah, we need your weapons and equipment, but so does the Iron Lady, badly. She's coming for it one way or another, and after her, something worse. Johnson seemed to relent. It was all the opportunity we needed. Days 641 to 644. We were allowed to stay at the armory, well, in a specific area for visitors, as we met with the rest of the settlement's leaders. The group was also very interested in what I had to say about the Iron Lady, the Army of the Dawn, and the Aztecos. The fact that I was a former service member myself and had been to battle against the Aztecos lent me a great deal of credibility in their eyes. Yet both sides had failed to come to an agreement. Once inside the compound, I'd gotten a glimpse at the veritable treasure trove of equipment being stored here. We needed that equipment badly, but Alexis was right. We needed them even more. Listen, the only thing that's going to convince you is seeing it for yourself. We've been at this for 2 days now. Neither side really wants to fight the other. So tell you what, give me one of your people. Let me show them the truth. I kind of took myself by surprise. I'd spoken well out of turn as Johnson and Ruslana had launched into a fresh argument, but I was sick and tired of the loggerheads both sides found themselves at. Johnson turned to look at me. "What are you proposing?" I had access to some of the Iron Lady's intelligence reports during my time with her. They've got a presence south, a few days over the border. It's small, but big enough camp that I can take you and show you what's waiting for all of us. Just need one of your guys, someone you trust. How do I know you won't just use him as a hostage? I'll stay. Now it was Alexis's turn to speak out of order, and I found myself immediately protesting. What? No, Ruslana can get someone else. Deal. Johnson agreed immediately. Could see that one means something to you. Fair enough. I'll give you family for family. You take care of my guy and bring him back safe, and you get your own back, and we'll see what he has to say. It was a win, but my guts were roiling inside. How could she go and do something so reckless after everything I'd done to keep her safe? Days 645 to 650. It took time to coordinate the trip I'd proposed. Watson immediately invited himself along, but I refused. Alana would be heartbroken to see him take on a dangerous mission again, and when I pointed that out, he blushed for a moment, a rare display of emotion from the usually stoic man. I couldn't take that joy from her. Not yet. Annie flat out told me that I had no choice in the matter. She was coming as well. Lilith tried to force her way in, only to be met with a resounding no from both Annie and I simultaneously. She sheepishly backed off and reluctantly agreed to stay with Alexis instead. Ruslana offered to send one of her best people with us, but the fewer of us there, the better. That left Claiborne, the representative from the Armory settlement. He was about my age and could immediately tell he too was a military veteran back in the old world. He seemed like a nice enough guy, given the circumstances, and surprisingly easygoing. I was worried they'd ship us off with someone who'd prove to be difficult, but I immediately had a good feeling about Claiborne. Ruslana needed to coordinate our passage south. We had to stay out of sight of all settlement patrols so nobody could leak word of our mission. This required changing some patrol routes in a way that didn't tip off our plan. When we were ready, though, we grabbed our gear and got ready to set off. Christina would be going back to Farmbridge with Ruslana's people, so that left Lucky, Alexis, and Lilith, who'd stay with the Armory people. Said my goodbyes to Christina and headed for the gate. I was surprised to find Alexis waiting for me there. Picking up on Alexis's unspoken cues, Annie hurried Claiborne along and out of earshot, leaving Alexis and I alone for the first time since I'd returned to Farmbridge. Hey, I stupidly couldn't think of what else to say, or rather, could think of a million things I wanted to say but none that I could. Leaving us behind. I know why you think that was the right thing to do, but it really was really shitty of you. I know, you know the worst part? The part that really hurts? This time I didn't even try to answer. I don't even hate you for it. Her eyes had welled up with tears. I could feel mine threatening to do the same. Suddenly, she threw her arms around me in a big hug. Please, come back. Days 651 to 661. We had to stay off the main roads to sneak our way south. We couldn't risk a single trader or patrol running across us and potentially tipping the Aztecos off. Our paranoia was well-founded. The Iron Lady had stressed on me that the Aztecos were more than a psychopathic, drug-addicted horde. They were experts at espionage and sabotage, having infiltrated the Army of the Dawn with operatives who willingly allowed themselves to be enslaved. The assassins I'd saved the Iron Lady from in her tent had been led there by slaves the army had brought along. Our caution slowed us down considerably. The cities were not just a mess of rubble and ruins, but more dangerous to travel there than through the open desert roads. Raiders and bandits hid in the ruins, having been pushed into the dead cities by Ruslana's alliance of settlements. But the bigger threat was fallout. The city ruins were still full of radioactive dust. The radioactivity would come in very, very low doses, but just walking through the ruins kicked up incredible amounts of dust. Get enough of it in your lungs, and even low amounts of radioactivity would kill you. We covered our mouths and noses and pushed on, traveling during the night and resting during the day. It took us 10 days to get to the San Diego outskirts. Days 662 to 666. We got to know Clayburn as we traveled. He preferred to be called Clay and said that before the end of the world, he and his girlfriend had a nice apartment near the ocean. After getting out of the military, he'd worked on some online show. I forgot what he called it. I asked about the girlfriend, dreading the worst, but apparently they both survived together before linking up with the veterans taking shelter at the armory. He was a likable guy. I was glad things back there hadn't come to bloodshed. Alexis was right. We needed to trust each other and cooperate. But I couldn't help but think about the Iron Lady because she had a point as well. We needed those weapons and supplies, so what if, even after our trip, they refused to cooperate? Well, I know what she'd do. Take what she needed and kill anyone in her way. All for the greater good, of course. I couldn't help but remember an argument Alexis had with Ruslana before we got to the armory. Ruslana had pointed out the need to secure these supplies by any means necessary, reminding me a lot of the Iron Lady herself. Alexis's response had been simple. How long do you expect to hold on to that which you take by force? Days 667 through 670. We were finally approaching the Mexican border. Ruslana's last Allied settlement was a day behind us. This was the Wild West. Nobody had managed to establish relations with any group of survivors in Mexico yet. What refugees had survived the massive windstorms driving radioactive debris down into the country, or the mass starvation that followed, had spoken of absolute chaos. The government had collapsed nearly overnight and the cartels ruled in its stead. The massive arsenals they'd amassed during the drug trade had come into great use, and they were actually probably the best prepared for the end of the world out of any group. But they had turned on each other in a bitter struggle for resources and non-irradiated living space. The resulting war had been brutal on a truly epic level, and what I knew from the Iron Lady's recon people was that the Aztecos had come out on top. We were headed south toward the coast on the Gulf of California side. From there, we'd cross the Gulfland into Sonora, Azteco country. There was supposed to be a settlement somewhere near Caborca, which marked the westernmost border of the territory, and it was there that I hoped to show Clay the real horror of what we were all facing. Days 671 to 674. We had little info on this part of Mexico, so we thought it best to travel off the main roads again. We'd plotted a route that should let us avoid most of the old major cities and anybody who might have set up in the ruins. With luck, we'd remain completely undetected. That luck would run out pretty soon. Days 675 to 677. We heard their horses before we saw them. Despite all our precautions, someone, somewhere had spotted us, and by the sound of the rapidly approaching hooves, we were sure their intent wasn't friendly. But the raiders didn't know how well armed we were. Before leaving the armory, Johnson had given us all night vision sights for our rifles. Dropping prone on the desert floor, we started picking off riders while they were still 200 meters away from us. 4 of the riders went down before it appeared as if the group had lost their nerve. Half of the remaining riders broke off. It wasn't obvious we weren't ordinary survivors ripe for plundering. The other half ignored their comrades and continued their charge, now returning wild and very inaccurate fire. Our return fire, though, was deadly accurate thanks to the night vision, and more riders dropped. With just 100 meters between us, the surviving riders broke off as well and fled. We ignored the cries of the wounded. This could be a small part of a larger group. It could be back with reinforcements. Instead, we dashed off on a fast trot, leaving the carnage we'd wrought behind us. Days 678 to 682. The territory was unfamiliar, not just geographically but politically. We had no idea who had survived here south of the border and what their allegiances were, so we had to travel with caution. This slowed us down considerably, but it was better to be safe than sorry. Our plan was to infiltrate the Azteco settlement and get up close enough to convince Clay that the threat was very real. To do this, we posed as slavers, with Annie as our catch. She took offense at this plan initially until I pointed out that a pretty girl was probably a more convincing slave than either of us would be. To look like we belonged amongst the psychopaths, I brought Halloween makeup supplies with us. It seems silly, but the Aztecos loved to paint their faces and bodies in a grotesque pseudo-reflection of what they imagined the real Aztecs would have looked like. It was all nonsense, of course, but the psychological effect of the paint and body modifications was irrefutable. I'd seen few things more terrifying than the hundreds of rushing Azteca warriors with mutilated and painted bodies, rushing headlong into certain deaths and not caring at all for it thanks to the powerful cocktail of drugs and stimulants they took beforehand. Days 683 to 687. We finally made it to a small village on the coast of the Gulf of California. We'd spent the day doing recon from a distance, gauging who, if anyone, lived there and what their affiliation may be. There seemed to be just a few families who set their boats out every day to fish and grow some crops on the side. Their life had probably changed very little since the end of the world, though there was no telling how good their catch was since the oceans had undergone extreme acidification from all the pollution and debris global nuclear war had caused. They were friendly enough though when we finally made contact, and we bartered with them for a place to stay, some food, and a boat we could use to cross the Gulf. They happily accepted 2 of our first aid kits and a stash of other medical supplies we'd brought specifically to barter with. This was the currency of the New World, and life-saving supplies were worth their weight in gold. Nobody would be making antibiotics again for decades at this rate. On our final day with them, we prepared to set out when suddenly the villagers called out an alarm. We could see the telltale dust trails from horses rapidly approaching in the distance. One of the older women rushed us into a house and told us to stay inside and be quiet. We did as we were told, but we had our rifles at the ready regardless. 4 men rode up and 2 of them immediately dismounted. They laughed brashly and pushed the villagers around at will. It was clear this village was under the thumb of these thugs, and they were here to collect taxes. The villagers put together what meager fish and crops they'd managed to scrape together and presented them, but the leader of these men immediately grew angry. Apparently, it wasn't enough. I spoke enough Spanish to navigate my way through a conversation, but I didn't need to be fluent to understand what that man was saying when he suddenly grabbed one of the young women and started dragging her toward the horses. His other dismounted companion grabbed another young girl and dragged her as well. It was clear that if the village couldn't pay its taxes and food supplies, they were willing to take substitutions. I thought about Christina and slavery. Then I thought about Alexis in chains. It was enough to spur me to action. I didn't give warning. Annie and Clay would have to catch up. I stepped out of the home and shouted at the man getting their attention. As the leader turned to face me, I brought my rifle up and put 2 directly in his chest. His stunned compatriot was quick to follow. The men on horseback cussed and reached for their weapons, but Annie and Clay were on the ball and dropped them too. Their horses ran off in fear, dragging their slain riders behind them. Immediately, the villagers started shouting and screaming. This was not what I've expected. The old woman who had hit us ran straight over, wailing and moaning. "What have you done? You've killed us all!" I was confused. We just saved 2 of their women from a horrible fate. Now, when they don't return to their boss, the boss is going to come here and kill us all. A sinking feeling filled my stomach, and I felt the world had dropped out from under me. "You go. Go now. We tell them something, a story, but you go. Please, just go now." I felt numb all over as we made our way to the boat. We tried to help them. We thought we were doing the right thing. I searched Annie and Clay's faces, but the look they wore said it all. We had to leave. We couldn't stay to protect these people. Too many other lives were depending on us. As we pushed our boat past the breaking waves, I fervently hoped the villagers would come up with a convincing story. Days 688 to 692. We landed the boat on the other side of the Gulf after spending most of the day crossing it. The small boat had an engine with just a few horsepower, and more than once I feared we'd end up sunk or stranded. But by some miracle, we made the crossing. We found a small cove that would perfectly hide our boat and dragged it up the beach, tying it to the biggest boulder we could find. Now it was time for our disguises. We had to look the part. We took Annie's rifle but let her keep a small sidearm, then tied a rope to her neck. Using Halloween makeup, Clay and I painted our faces in a facsimile of what we'd seen Azteca warriors do. Their body paint seemed pretty random, so as long as we got the colors right, I didn't think we'd draw much attention. Clay was concerned about the fact that we were obviously Americans, but I told him that I'd seen many white Aztecos in that human wave attack against the Army of the Dawn. They were equal opportunity psychopaths. Finished with our preparations, we set off. It would only be a few days before we reached Caborca. Days 693 to 696. It didn't take long to see signs of the Azteco presence. There were a few traders on the road, men and women who kept their heads down and avoided making eye contact or conversation with us. That was good, I suppose, meant we looked the part, but I couldn't shake the haunted look in their eyes. I'd seen people living under the Iron Lady's oppression, but this was completely different. We knew we were near, however, when we started to come across bodies. Men and women who had been strung up on trees or the sides of buildings with obvious signs of torture on their bodies. Some had writing in what I hoped was red paint, but it was probably not, spelling out a list of crimes the person had committed. The brutality on display paled in comparison to anything I'd seen with the Army of the Dawn. Clay was starting to believe the wild stories I'd spun about the Aztecos. Days 697 to 699. A large settlement had sprung up in Caborca. Though entering it felt like we were traveling back in time 1,000 years. The Aztecos had taken their whole Aztec theme to heart and leveled large parts of the old town only to rebuild it with slave labor in the style of the ancient Aztecs. There were even numerous stepped pyramids with more under construction and a particularly large one on the far end of town. It was impressive in all the wrong ways. The town was surprisingly crowded though, which was good as it allowed us to blend in better. A year ago, the Iron Lady's spies had said this was a mere border outpost for the Aztecos. Clearly, things had dramatically changed. It didn't bode well for Farmbridge or even Arizona. If they were expanding this far west, it would be maybe a year before they reached the border and beyond. We bartered for lodging, handing over bullets and a few grenades we'd brought. Nobody was much interested in medical supplies, which somehow didn't surprise me. We kept Annie on a tight leash, literally for her own protection and to sell the illusion that she was our personal slave. It bought us just enough credibility that nobody seemed to bat much of an eye at our presence. Just two more wastelanders in the crowded, dirty, violent city. It seemed that the Aztecos had adopted many of the old religious customs of the ancient Aztecs, and human sacrifice was, by no surprise, a major theme. A bustling slave market had sprung up here, and it turned my stomach to see men, women, and even children being bought and sold. Some would end up on the sacrificial altar at the large pyramid on the other end of town. Clay had seen about enough. He was convinced. The Aztecos were a clear and present danger to all of us, and none of us could overcome it alone. Day 700. We'd made plans to cross the Gulf with to get out of Azteco territory into the other side. Against Annie's wishes, though, I took the opportunity to scout the town on my own. This was a golden opportunity to try to get better intelligence on what we were dealing with. Few of the locals spoke up in exchange for some ammo and homemade liquor I'd traded for earlier. The Aztecos were indeed expanding, and a small contingent of their warriors were gathering to bring the territory north and west of the town under their control. A few of the old drug cartels were holding out, but were vastly outnumbered and would soon be extinct. Just more victims to be sacrificed to the Azteco gods. I should have been more alert. I didn't notice the figure sliding up behind me until it was too late, and the strong arm wrapped around my neck, dragging me into a darkened alley. I instinctively bit down on the arm, and the man holding me let out a short yell, which I cut off by delivering an elbow straight to his gut. But before I could do anything else, a second man smashed me in the head with a wooden club, making me fall to the ground and see stars. He bent down and picked my head up, rubbing the paint off my face. Good, gringo. You have a lot of fight. You'll do well for me in the arena. Now go check out how this all started with I Survived 100 Days of Nuclear War, or click this other video instead.